So I'd like to welcome you to our new web series run out of the Berlin office on transatlantic perspectives on a post-pandemic world. The objective of this series is to bring leading voices from politics, economics, and society to discuss how the coronavirus has had an impact on all of our lives on both sides of the Atlantic. Today, we're going to talk to two experts on what kind of or how economic recovery can be jump-started in a post-pandemic world. And we're really grateful that we have Thea, and Reiner Hoffmann with us. Before I hand over to our moderator, Elena Bryan, who is a senior non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, I'd like to also thank our Business Alliance members for the support of our programming: Google, Pfizer, Bayer, and Deloitte. So without much ado, I'm going to now hand over to Elena, and everybody enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Sudha. Good morning from Washington and good afternoon to our European audience. Today we are still in the middle of the pandemic, the public health crisis, the economic crisis the virus provoked, and significant social upheaval. In the US, we are also exactly 16 weeks away from a presidential election. This is a Tuesday, so it's 16 weeks. It's rather amazing to me how profoundly the world has changed in the last few months. There is a robust discussion on both sides of the Atlantic on how to achieve economic recovery, both in the immediate term, including as a second wave of COVID-19 is predicted, and over the longer term. One question is the role international trade and globalization can and should play in the post-COVID world. Today we have two terrific guests to discuss these topics, including U.S. and European approaches to economic recovery. Thea has been president of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington since 2018. Previously, she was deputy chief of staff at the AFL-CIO. Thea is very well known in Washington, including in the trade world. Reiner Hoffmann has been president of the German Trade Union Confederation since 2014. He's also worked at European level as director of the European Trade Union Institute and deputy secretary general of the European Trade Union Confederation. Reiner is also an alumnus of GMF's Marshall Memorial Fellowship. Thea and Reiner will each give opening remarks. I will then pose a few questions to them, and we will take questions from the audience. Two administrative points. This webinar is on the record and will be recorded. If you have a question, please use the chat function. You can address your questions to all panelists. I'd like to recognize Thea now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Sudha. Thanks to the German Marshall Fund, and thanks to all of you who are spending an hour with us today. So I was going to start by talking about the scope and the magnitude and the speed of the economic crisis that hit the United States and many, many parts of the world. And one of the things, we haven't seen anything like this in most of our lifetimes. And not only did this hit with this incredible power, but it came at the same time as a public health crisis. And in the United States, because I think many of you know, our health system is not as robust, our social safety net is tattered, that having the health crisis and an economic crisis at the same time is particularly devastating. And the other point about this economic recession in terms of the United States is that unlike many recessions, which tend to hit construction and manufacturing first, this recession hit at low-wage sectors of the economy first, so that the most vulnerable, and often people of color in the United States, were the frontline people hit, both in terms of loss of jobs, loss of income, but also in terms of those workers who were deemed essential workers who had to keep going to work, sometimes under very unsafe conditions and without the kind of protections they needed, the paid sick leave or the health care that would have made their jobs safer. Unemployment has hit 11% in terms of the official numbers. Our calculation is that it's closer to 15% when you take into account those people who are working, who are temporarily unemployed but misclassified, or those people who have dropped out of the labor force because they can't find jobs during this crisis. We are about 15 million jobs down from where we need to be. And this is, I think, last week was the 15th week in a row that the new unemployment insurance claims were more than twice as high as the worst week of the Great Recession, 2008-2009. The disparate impact on Black and brown workers and women, especially Latina and Black women, older workers and essential workers, hits on many different dimensions. The ability to work remotely changes in the United States with your income, your education level, and your race. And so we see that has hurt people. That the pre-existing health conditions, the access to health care, the neighborhoods, the necessity of using public transit are also racially biased in the United States. And of course, the amount of savings or wealth that families have is tremendously imbalanced in the United States, with the average Black family having less than 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. And in an economic crisis that lasts for several months, this is an extremely important element. The government response has been large in terms of numbers, about $3 trillion, and yet in the United States, it's been a patchwork result of political compromise and haste, with sort of a strange patchwork quilt of elements, some of which have been very useful. I would say the most important has been the expansion and the extension and the expanded eligibility of the unemployment insurance system in the United States. That has helped keep a lot of people out of poverty. That has helped pay the bills for many people, and yet it is set to expire at the end of this month if Congress does not act. There has been a lot of aid to small, medium, and large businesses in the United States, including the Paycheck Protection Act, which was important for small businesses to keep their doors open, and they were required to keep people on payroll if they wanted to get that assistance as a grant and not a loan. The rest of the business aid had fewer strings attached, not as much transparency as we would have liked to see, and therefore was not as effective as it could have been and not as targeted. One of the key elements should be aid from the federal government to state and local governments. This was inadequate in the CARES Act so far. We at EPI have said we need at least another $1 trillion of federal aid to state and local governments. This is absolutely essential, both to keep essential public services available, healthcare, education, letting people stay safe, but also in terms of the employment impact. So those are the key issues. There are many structural issues that are raised by this crisis, and I hope we'll have more time during the Q&A to talk about this, but it is totally clear that the US economy was and is vulnerable to shocks of this kind. We were woefully unprepared in terms of public health measures. We hadn't stockpiled. We don't have good procurement mechanisms in place to make sure that we get essential health equipment to frontline workers. We don't have any automatic triggers for relief. And the political process is dysfunctional and slow. Our social safety net is inadequate and underfunded and antiquated. And our worker voice, worker power, collective bargaining, and the ability of unions to protect workers has been eroded over several decades of attacks on unions and weak and outdated labor laws. That we see, and I hope Reiner will talk about this more, is an essential piece of what we need to think about going forward as we rebuild the US economy and address some of these structural inadequacies, and of course take on some of those issues around paid sick leave, which any civilized country should have, and universal health care. So with that, hopefully just touching very briefly on some of those issues. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to Reiner's remarks.
Thank you, Thea. Reiner, could you give your perspective?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, first of all, thanks for the invitation. As an alumni of the German Marshall Fund, it's a pleasure to join you in this webinar. Very brief remarks on the situation in Germany, which is, as in many other countries, the economy is hardly affected by the COVID-19 virus, but I can say also from a trade union perspective, the German government has responded quite fast and adequately to the economic and the social challenges. The government has adopted a second fiscal package in order to help economic Recovery, which is the largest fiscal stimulus plan in German history. And it's built upon 4 pillars, which includes many detailed programs on the demand and including demand and supply side measures. I will touch only very briefly the 4 key areas or the key pillars which are important to respond to the economic crisis. First of all is strengthening economic recovery through incentives for broad consumption, and here the reduction of the VAT tax is quite significant. Since the 1st of July, VAT has been reduced from 19 to 16%, and we will see to which extent this will help to give a significant stimulus for recovery. But there are other important measures, as for example, a so-called child bonus, which will be paid to all families. And this will have also an impact for low-income families, and the volume of this child bonus package is approximately 4.3 billion euros. The second pillar of the stimulus plan is focusing on boosting income stability, liquidity for companies, and give incentives for investment. That shows that we are not focusing on the demand side, also strengthening the supply side. And from a workers' perspective, in Germany, as in many other European countries, the extension of the what we are calling Kurzarbeit, the short-time work scheme, is quite important to avoid that employees will become unemployed. And this short-time work scheme has been extended to 12 months. And I hope that in September, after the summer break in Germany, it will go even beyond the 12 months up to 24 months. The figures we have in Germany are quite high. For the time being, more than 7 million workers are covered by the short-time work scheme, but that means at the same time that 7 million people has not yet become unemployed, and they receive 60% of their payment, and this will be increased up to 70% after 4 months, and after 7 months it will increase the compensation up to 70%. This is important, especially for workers with low incomes, which suffer heavily from an income loss of 40%. A third important element of the stimulus plan in Germany is that we don't ignore the necessity to invest into the future, especially in reducing the carbon footprint and promoting research and development and digitalization. Because what we have been experienced before COVID-19, that the climate change is a huge challenge all over the world, and that we have to give a robust response to climate change. And here one of the key factors is stimulating investment. I don't go into detail. I'm coming to the fourth point, which is quite important for the German fiscal stimulus plan, that is public investment, especially or in particular for municipalities. And municipalities, which cover a large share of public investment in Germany, will receive a fiscal support from the federal budget, which is amounting to an additional 4 billion euro over the next 12 months. And this will help municipalities also to continue in their investment strategy. So far, the situation in Germany, unemployment is for the time being under control, but we see that some sectors are very hard affected, especially in the small and medium-sized companies, in the service sector, but also big industry, as for example the car industry, has been affected very, very heavily. What is important is that we are pretty much aware that such national activities from the governance are not sufficient enough. At least we have a European responsibility, and since the 1st of July, Germany has taken over the presidency of the European Union, and here by the end of this week, under the leadership of the German Chancellor, the European Union has also to discuss and hopefully to decide on a European COVID-19 recovery program. And what we will see is that, especially if it comes to the fiscal criteria of the monetary union, that those have been relaxed in order that member states will be allowed to have a higher public debt than the ceiling of 60%. And I hope very much that this will be extended over the forthcoming years, and that we will be able, with a European recovery program, to support also those countries which are even more affected, especially in the source of Europe. And the third aspect, I think, which we are suffering from a much closer international cooperation, multilateralism is at risk, and if I may be frank, is at risk also concerning the behavior of the American government. We saw the critiques on the World Health Organization, but we see also that trade conflicts will not help, that we need a new type of trade agreements all over the world, trade agreements also between Europe and the United States. But if I say we need new trade agreements, it's not simply the old style of trade agreements which are neglecting social and environmental standards. And the lesson we should learn from the COVID-19 pandemic is that we need ever more international cooperation under the umbrella of the multilateral organizations. For example, to strengthen really the International Labour Organization, but also to give a new impetus in the WTO, because COVID is facing the globe entirely, and no single state will be able to act at his own. So my message is also that transatlantic cooperation has to be re-strengthened in order not only to fight against the COVID pandemic, but also to give a robust response to climate change, and in order to shape digitalization for the future.
Thank you. Thank you to both Thea and Reiner for giving us a perspective on what's happening in the US and Germany and Europe. It strikes me that the government actions and interventions on either side of the water were interventions on a different base with different capabilities on both sides. As a trade person, I'm very keenly interested in the issue of trade agreements and multilateralization. I was in Brussels for 6 years when we were doing the TTIP negotiations, and some of those questions came up occasionally, including when I was in Germany. So my question for both of you is a two-part question. So governments have taken initially short-term actions, I think in hopes that the pandemic would end quickly. I know in the U.S. there are some key elements of the intervention that will end at the end of July. We're not done with this pandemic. We've got a long haul. When people say post-pandemic, I think, when does that start? But the question is, or the answer is, that things need to be done now, immediately, and then with a perspective in the longer term. So for each of you, what needs to be done next, I think, in our countries? And how do you see the long-term aspects, including trade and multilateral cooperation? It's easy when you have a crisis to look domestically, but in our world, everything is linked. So how do we go forward with globalization and trade, and having a success in rebuilding trust, and maybe someday getting rid of this virus, or at least being able to quarantine it like we've been quarantined? Thea?
Sure, I'll jump right in. Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Reiner. It's really wonderful to hear your perspective. I think here in the United States, when we hear how much the Europeans have done, how quickly, how smoothly the response went, we're a little bit jealous. But in terms of what needs to happen next, I would say it's very clear in the short run what needs to happen. We are in the middle of July. We have key elements of the CARES Act that are about to expire, especially the unemployment insurance extension. So it's a no-brainer. Unemployment is still around 11 to 15%. It's still very, very high. We absolutely cannot cut off this lifeline at this moment in time. Congress needs to get its act together. They need to go ahead and make sure that that is extended as long as is needed. And I think the measure that Reiner talked about, we have some small versions of the short-term work piece in our unemployment extension, and that has been very helpful, so that if workers go back to work a couple of hours a week or short-term, that they are not punished for doing that, but that they are made whole. This is a crisis that is created by the government telling people to stay home, telling businesses to stay closed, and it is the government's job to take care of folks during that period. The other piece, of course, is that the CARES Act didn't cover everybody. Undocumented workers in particular were the most glaring exception, and so that should be addressed. I think it's unlikely it will be, but it should be. The second piece, as I mentioned before, is the state and local aid, which if the federal government, which has the capacity to deficit spend, state and local governments don't have that capacity. They've lost tons of revenue in terms of sales tax, income tax. They will start laying more people off. They will have a second round of economic catastrophe if the federal government doesn't step in to help them. So that is essential. And but as we think about the medium to long term, it's clear that the US economy, as most of the global economy, will go through massive transitions over the next couple of years. Big sectors will shrink dramatically or disappear. This is an opportunity for the federal government to invest in a very generous scale in infrastructure, which is needed in the United States, in renewable energy, and in the care economy, things like public health and education. It's clear that as we think about how we're going to reopen schools, for example, it will be costly to have smaller class sizes, to have more cleansing measures, to have better options for online learning. We all patched it together for the last couple of months. We survived, but this is not something that we can maintain over the long term without some significant investments. And so those are the things, and this is not the moment for people to be fretting about the budget deficit. This is the moment, it's an emergency. Our hair is on fire, and the federal government needs to step up and take all those measures. And in terms of trade, Elena, just quickly, I think as we see this, we understand that we need to think about the trading system. We need to think about writing new rules, as Reiner said, that we are addressing labor and environmental standards and rights and human rights and democracy protections and safety protections in our trading rules, that we don't see them just as tools for multinational corporations to make more money moving around the globe. And I think we can and should move in that direction. And it's clear that we need better cooperation mechanisms in place. And I agree that between the International Labor Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, not only do we need to strengthen the organizations, we need them to talk to each other. We need to make sure that our international apparatus is connecting labor rights and protections to health protections to trade protections. And so I'll leave it there and look forward to Reiner's answer.
Thank you, Reiner.
No, I can agree entirely that especially if we reflect that trade was a key driver of globalization, and globalization has created significant wealth for citizens, but this wealth is unequal distributed. And we see that this inequality has been increased. And if we like to get back confidence of citizens and confidence also on international cooperation, including trade, and to have a more fair approach of globalization, then we have also to talk about the redistribution of wealth, that those who are suffering today, not only in the United States, not only in Europe, if I look to the situation in the Asian Pacific, or if I look to the situation in Africa, then we need really to make use of the opportunity we have now to bring into practice a new to be restructured, arguing for some sort of new protectionism, but to argue about more an approach for more fair trade and fair globalization. And this is what we are working on with the European Trade Union Confederation, together with AFL-CIO, under the umbrella of the International Trade Union Confederation. This is a challenge for us, and the question is, will we be able to materialize the opportunities coming from the crisis to such a new path, which is creating a better life for all citizens? And I agree entirely that public health is and absolutely crucial. And here we have seen also that over the last decades, that the privatization of our public health systems have been good for those who are making profit out of the health systems, but are not of advantage for those who really are depending on a solid and sustainable public health system all over the world.
Thank you. I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience now. The first one, I'm going to combine questions a little bit. So the first question is, given the different social support structures in the EU and the US, how can transatlantic cooperation help to drive forward economic recovery on similar grounds with similar outcomes? And one piece of that, for example, is how the self-employed are treated. Western governments have promoted self-employment in order to boost dynamism and labor market flexibility. but has the support to those self-employed actually been sufficient in the pandemic?
I'll just jump in quickly on that and then leave it to Reiner. In terms of self-employed, one of the big advantages of the expansion of the unemployment insurance system was covering a lot of people who are not eligible normally in the United States, including self-employed and gig workers and part-time and short-hour workers. And everybody got this minimum $600 payment. So if they could get through the system, there was a lot of bureaucracy and there was a lot of slowness, unconscionable slowness in terms of the United States. How did the two systems, I mean, what I would hope in terms of when we look across the Atlantic to see a much more robust social safety net that is much more generous and much more, longer term and so on, that we can learn from each other, because I think one of the things we see is that having this social safety net in place creates some buffer zone. This is exactly what is needed, is that workers should not feel desperate to have to go back to work on unsafe conditions because they have no other alternatives. And so I would hope the United States will take some lessons from the European systems, that having in place, first of all, the healthcare and the income supports that are needed at least helps people stay home safely when they need to do that. So those are some of the, I think, transatlantic lessons that we can take advantage of at this moment.
Yeah, if it comes to self-employed people, I think these are those who are suffering very heavily, because also in Europe, and especially I can speak about Germany, self-employed people are not covered by the social safety net in Germany, because the social safety net is based on contribution, and they are not employed, so there is no employer who is contributing to the social security systems, neither for the unemployment system or for the retirement system. And one solution is, as also for Germany, as for many other member states of the European Union, first to reflect much more in depth what self-employment means, because most of the self-employed are false self-employed. If I look to the digital economy or the platform economy, they are all not responsible as an employer. They don't pay the taxes, they don't pay the social security contributions, they are not covered by collective agreements. So this is something which is relating to the digitalization of labor with new types of businesses, and we are not against new types of businesses so long as they are covered by decent systems of social security and they are covered by our systems of industrial relations or our system of social partnership. And yeah, please.
Go ahead. No.
No.
No, I was going to just jump in and agree with you on that point, that it's, it's one thing to talk about the gig economy and the digital platforms. It's another thing for employers to abdicate the responsibilities
Absolutely.
that they have. And I wanted to just also make clear one thing that I forgot to say, which is that, we've added self-employed workers to our unemployment just for this emergency period of the pandemic. This should be something that we think about doing going forward. This is the kind of structural form, Elena, I think that you were mentioning. Sorry, Reiner, go ahead.
Yeah, but absolutely right. But here you can see also the international dimension. In the gig economy, the definition of employers and employees have to be renewed. And since the platform economy has no borders, because it doesn't matter that you deliver your services from China, from Japan, or from the United States, but they are in the same situation. So who is responsible for social security contributions and who is really responsible as an employer to guarantee a certain safety net for employees, even for self-employed people? And one argument I forgot to make it in my first intervention, as you mentioned earlier, The strength in most of the member states of the European Union is that we have still more or less strong industrial relation systems in place. And what we are experiencing in Germany is that people who are employed in companies which are covered by collective agreements and companies which have a decent participation of workers, we call them works council, are much better off and feel much more secure because we are guaranteeing a certain safety net. And people experiencing this now in the crisis, but they make their lessons also that this could contribute and help in this transition process, which we will be faced over the next decades, driven by digitalization, driven by climate change. So that one lesson and one area of more in-depth exchange is how we can strengthening industrial relation systems and how we can push employers to be more responsible vis-a-vis the challenges and vis-a-vis the interests of workers. This in a global economy driven also by digitalization will be not sufficient to do it only at the national level, at the nation state. At least we try to set up some rules at the European level, but this should be also for further cooperation with the United States, with other regions of the world, together with the ITUC. I think this is one lesson we should learn from this crisis, that with decent industrial relation systems, we are much better off to handle or to shape this huge challenges we are facing with the pandemic, but also with structural changes.
Thank you. So, you know, it strikes me in the world of international trade, you can stop things, you can stop goods at a border. You can't really stop services very efficiently. And we certainly can't stop the virus. This is a global pandemic. And we've all done a lot of national domestic focus, which is vital. We have a lot of discussions about transatlantic cooperation. But this is also, this is a global pandemic, and there's been a disruption of trust, I think, between countries. How do we restore that? How do we use the multilateral systems, not only the trade system, but what do we do multilaterally? What kind of institutions do you see as important? And how do we restore trust between the countries of the world?
Well, one starting point for the United States is probably new leadership. But just to say that, you know, because certainly I would like to see the United States play its role in supporting and funding the World Health Organization at a minimum. But I think that this moment is so important. And the initial crisis, I think it's not unusual that countries looked inwards and closed their borders and just tried to scramble around to do whatever they could to take care of people. But we have some warning now. We know this is here for the long term. This will probably not be the last pandemic that we experience or the last kind of international health crisis. And therefore, let's take time to put in place measures where we can build the ability for international cooperation and trust. I'm not sure exactly how that happens, but things like, you know, when the vaccine is available, it should be available as broadly as possible at lower prices possible to the places where it's needed most. I think one of the people in the chat box was asking about developing countries. I think that's such an important point, because we know that as bad as this crisis is in the industrialized world, certainly in the United States of America, it is much worse. It is much more dangerous. It is hurting very vulnerable people in developing countries. Do we have the capacity to provide adequate financial aid to those countries. I think one route would be through the International Monetary Fund, through the special drawing rights, which is something that has been done in the past, and I think could be done again, and maybe should be done and should be experimented with. It's a way, it's almost like the global Federal Reserve, to use a U.S. analogy, but to be able to make funds available to developing countries to make sure that they can put in place the kind of public health measures, buy the protective equipment, allow for whatever measures of quarantine or distancing can be done. So I think those things are important. And I think as we think about the trading system, we need to make sure that the World Trade Organization rules are not so constrictive around things like government procurement, that it makes it very difficult for countries to either recover from the crisis or to make sure that they are investing in creating good jobs. So I would like to see more lenience around government procurement, and then better rules around labor rights, environmental, climate change, which is of course looming and something we can't forget right now. And I don't think that the World Trade System is well equipped at the moment to make sure that as countries move forward at different paces to mitigate climate change, that they don't experience competitive disadvantage from doing that. But also cooperation around taxes. I think, you know, I said before that we shouldn't be worrying about the budget deficit now, but at some point as the economies begin to recover, we will need to replace, we will need to raise revenues. And we should make sure that global movement of financial capital doesn't punish countries that are raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy in order to fund all these necessary pieces. So those are, I think, some pieces that I think are important.
Yeah, I can't agree more what you have said. And if I put it short, we need better rules at international level, and we need to stop deregulation, especially deregulation of our labor markets. But this starts at the national level, and what we are doing here in Germany is to strengthen social and workers' rights, to strengthen also the environmental perspective, that climate change is not a risk for jobs, it is an opportunity to create new jobs. And what we are doing at the national level, what we are doing here in Germany, could be a good signal, some kind of benchmark for Europe. Because even if I look to the European Union is not in a good shape, and we have learned our lesson. Even the German government and the Christian Democrats have learned the lesson that we have to be much more responsible vis-a-vis the European integration. That it is not only a free market zone, that the European Union is based on common values, and we have to strengthen our values. And this leads also to re-strengthening the transatlantic cooperation and the transatlantic partnership, because both sides on the Atlantic are based on common values and common understanding. I have lost some trust in the present administration in the United States, frankly. But nevertheless, we should not ignore the common values and the basis for our joint cooperation. And this means also then to strengthening the international organizations, as I said earlier. And we have to look also how we can make business much more responsible. Giving an example from this morning, I had a talk with colleagues from the Industry Association, the BDI, and they started, they asked me to discuss opportunities concerning the Mercosur agreement, the trade agreement with the European Union and the Mercosur countries. And I said, look, I'm not against an agreement with Mercosur, but you have to be aware that this is not simply a trade agreement, that we have to implement common standards and goals for labor rights and for the environment. And if we have an agreement on this, I think then we can rebuild also trade structures which are of common interest and not only in the interest of a few companies. And I can see, at least in some companies, where we have a leadership which is much more responsible, that they understood the lessons. And here again, the basis the basis for this is really to have a decent social dialogue, decent industrial relations. Even if we have different interests, we should focus what we have in common. And what we have in common is not enough any longer at the national level. We have to expand this, and we have to take responsibility vis-a-vis the global dimension in total.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're about out of time. Do you have any final comments?
I have a final comment, because it's a long time that I haven't been in touch with the German Marshall Fund. I remember, I think 4, probably 5 years ago, we had a nice workshop, not via video conference, in Washington on the trade agreement with the United States and Europe, which was very interesting. And I think the GMF is a good platform to re-strengthening our cooperation in a good direction.
Thank you.
I'll just say a final closing word. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation. It's great to engage. One thing that I would see as a direction going forward is for the United States and the European Union we have a lot of common grounds around the issues that we care about labor rights, human rights, democracy, the environment, and I think some shared economic concerns, even in terms of currency manipulation and tax treatment. And I know there was one question there about post-COVID EU, US, China relations. And I think that's one obvious area where if the United States and the European Union had a common front about resetting and reprioritizing some of these important issues, particularly labor rights, human rights, and the environment and currency in our relationship with China, I think that would be much more powerful than allowing ourselves to be played off against each other. So that's the kind of direction that I think would be wonderful to see going forward in coming years. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you both for your insights and inputs and ideas. There's certainly a lot to work on going forward, including a more robust, renewed transatlantic cooperative relationship. So on behalf of GMF, thank you very much. And thanks to the audience for your questions and your attention. Sign off here. Thanks.